Hello. So now we switch gears and pick up what we have learned about how evolution works since Darwin, and we have put together knowledge of genetics that he never could have done because he and Mendel were working at the same time, so to speak, and they didn't know of each other. So this is all about genetics because passing on traits and having those traits change is all about genetics. So here is what our modern synthesis, that is the phrase somebody chose to talk about our modern theory of evolution. We're synthesizing, putting together genetics and evolutionary stuff. First of all, we emphasize already that individuals don't evolve, groups do. And the group we have defined as a population is what we've defined as the group that's evolving. Um, the natural selection process that Darwin unveiled to the world, kind of, so to speak, we've learned there's at least three others, maybe four, depends on how you look at it, mechanisms, things that can cause evolution to happen, right? But natural selection is still by far the one that causes the most evolutionary change. Okay. And then we have the idea that small changes over long periods of time can cause big changes, like the evolution of new species, new kingdoms, entire new kingdoms, and things like that. That can happen, we've learned, with small changes occurring over time. So here we go with this idea. This is what a population is, right? All members of the same species and localized group. That's a little tough to define sometime. We'll give it a little definition in class, but generally kind of isolated in space and time. So I'll use a simple example. Here you have some catfish of a certain species in a lake here. This is the same example I'll probably use in class. Here you have some catfish. They're both the same species, but this lake is like in Palatka, 100 miles away. So what defines these as two different populations, even though they're the same species, is they can't intermate with each other. They can't mix their genes up because they can't bump into each other to mate. So this is an example of clearly two different populations. But for organisms that can move around, it's hard to have a real clear definition sometimes of what a population is. Note, however, I meant to say that this word has been used by you for a long time in your life, usually to mean a number. In this case, the word population refers to a group. That group is going to have a population. If there's 1,000 catfish in this lake, that's the population size of that population, the group that we're calling a population of fish. All right, so anyway, so the gene pool of this population is simply every single gene that's in every single organism in that population. So gene frequency now would simply be a little math applied to that gene pool concept. If this was to represent a gene pool, I've just put two individuals' genotypes in here just to simplify, right? If this was represented the entire gene pool of this population for this particular gene, gene A, the frequency of big A is 0.75, right? We have four genes here represented. Three of them are big A. Frequency of little a, 0.25. We'll come back to this math in a little while later. But that's the simple idea of what frequency means. So now, this is the second most, maybe tied with one from each pair, concept that's hard to sit in your head. Exactly what this thing means, that's called the Hardy-Weinberg theorem, sometimes the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. One of the key ideas that these two guys, Mr. Hardy and Mr. Weinberg, right, they've just hyphenated their names together. One of the key ideas that they have, that they came across separately, and then we've given both of their names to this idea, is that if we have a population like this one, now I've pictured this one, kind of the same idea as the other. I put a few more individuals in there, but that might represent millions of individuals in this particular group and their genes. Okay, if you notice, we have frequency of A is now 0.5. I just made it a little different, right? We have 8 genes here. 4 of them are big A. 4 of them are little a. So the frequency is 0.5 and 0.5, right? Half and half, right? What they figured out is that this population, as time goes by and the years go by and the generations go by, these gene frequencies won't change just because individuals have offspring. The process that involves meiosis and random fertilization, crossing over, all that stuff that causes variety, won't cause these frequencies to change. So now, what we define evolution as now is a change in these frequencies. Either the frequencies of the genes or the frequencies of the genotypes. Now you see here, I've got 4 genotypes represented that again represent our population. The frequency of that genotype is 0.25, right? 1 out of the 4 is them. The frequency of the heterozygote is 0.50 in my example, right? And the frequency of the homozygous recessive is 0.25. Part of the Hardy-Weinberg theorem is that these numbers, both the gene frequency and the genotype frequency, won't change just because of births and deaths, just because of the variety that sexual reproduction involves. These genes will get shuffled up. You might get new combinations of genes, but these won't change unless something is causing them to change. And those somethings are what we're going to now talk about, natural selection being one of them that can cause these to change. But now we're going to add 3 or 4 others to that list of things that can cause gene frequencies to change. The value of defining a situation in which the gene frequencies won't change is that it gives us a null hypothesis to then use kind of like a control group in an experiment to compare to and see if change has happened. And we'll practice with that stuff because that's the thing they're going to ask you to do on the AP test. State a null hypothesis in terms of this particular thing, and null in this case means no, and the null hypothesis here is that this population won't change over time. That's the null hypothesis. That's not reality. We're going to see that reality is that evolution is always happening. What we're going to define it as is a change in either these numbers or both, gene frequencies, genotype frequencies, or both, and that we're now going to talk about some of the other factors besides natural selection that can make them change. Okay, so here let's do a practice Hardy-Weinberg thing. It's a kind of a question they might ask. This is right from an old AP test. So these numbers in this math we're about to do are all under the assumption that this population they're describing is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And we kind of just said that no population really can be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. But to do this math, that assumption has to be made, right? And then if we find that the actual population has different numbers in terms of gene and genotype frequencies, then what the math dictates, that is our evidence that this population is evolving, not in equilibrium. So, okay, so with that being said, we have 24 birds that have a recessive phenotype. The other 63 That means there's 87 total, right? So all these numbers are important to not mix up, right? 63 is the number of birds who show the dominant trait. I'm going to use a B since this is a beak defect trait, right? What we don't know about those 63 birds is if they're homozygous or heterozygous, because that's dominant, okay? So like in so many heredity questions, we start by focusing on the ones that we do know for sure. 24 of them had 2 recessive genes. That we know by sure by looking at their phenotype or seeing their phenotype. What's the frequency of those that had 2 recessive genes? 24 out of 87, not out of 63, right? Because to get a frequency, you always divide the part by the whole, right? So there's a couple of mistakes you could possibly have made so far. Here's your given information. They could have told you like 24 out of 87 birds. So they could have given you the total, right? But you can easily calculate any of these 3 variables, how many recessives, how many dominants, and how many total if you're given the other 2, right? And so you just have to assess what you have and make sure you don't mix up which numbers you use when you do your math. And then this is not too hard. Practice a little bit. So, okay, so this is what we just said. We identified that of our 2 tools that we have to use, the gene frequencies have to add up to 100%, right? We only have 2 genes. Their frequencies are P and Q, has to equal 100%, right? And then the genotype frequencies, homozygous dominant, heterozygous, homozygous recessive, oops, that's squared. That has to equal 1. These equations are tools, and of all these variables, right, the only one that we can figure out with the given information is this one, right? Take ourselves back to the question, remember, we're looking for P, we're looking for this one, but this number of individuals with the recessive trait is not the number of recessive genes. It's the number of individuals who have 2 recessive genes. And in our symbols, that is symbolized as Q squared. So we did the math. Q squared came out to be that, right? We simply take the square root of that, and we get this for Q. Subtract from 1. Now we use this tool, right? Subtract from 1. We get that for P. That's our answer to this question, okay? Now let's see if they had asked you a different question. How many heterozygous individuals were there in this population? That's the thing, again, you can't see by looking at them. They look the same phenotype as the ones who are homozygous dominant. But if this population is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, and that we have to have that disclaimer, so to speak, but if they are in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, like you were told, then we can continue our math. Now that we know both P and Q, we also know that this is the expression to give us the frequency of heterozygous individuals. And so 2 times 0.7 times 0.525, 0.53, whatever, comes out to be 0.49. But if they asked us for the number of individuals, we simply have to take 0.49, 49% of the total, not of the number who have the dominant trait, which was, 63, but of the total, and we get 43 heterozygous individuals. Capiche? Easy stuff. So this is all straight AP syllabus here, this whole page. They have a list of conditions that Mr. Hardy and Mr. Weinberg identified must be true if this population is going to not evolve, which is again providing for us a null hypothesis to then test and see if the population we're studying has evolved. Then it means one of these 5 things or more must have not been the way this says they need to be to not evolve. I know that was confusing, but just let it soak into your brain for a little bit, because again, this gets a little tough until it soaks into your brain, right? So if this population, this group of organisms, all the same species, same kind of general location, right? If they're going to not evolve, the population size needs to be kind of big. We're going to say why, just we're going to elaborate on all of these. There can't be any migration happening. There can't be any mutations happening. Mating has to be random. We'll talk about that vaguely. That's the one we could probably cancel out of here. But there can't be any natural selection going on, right? So you say, wait a minute, mutations are always going to happen. And natural selection, that's like always happening. And that's why, in reality, you can't find a non-evolving population. But it's important to define one to compare evolving ones to, right? You have to have again, it's like kind of like a control group in an experiment. They end up being the null hypothesis by which you're going to test your experimental hypothesis that I think this population is evolving because of this, this, and this. Because notice what they do here, right? Again, this is the AP people. This Hardy-Weinberg idea does not imply that populations don't evolve. They're going to likely ask you to make predictions about the potential evolutionary future of some group that they describe to you, right? They'll describe some situation where natural selection is in play, most likely, maybe migration, but probably natural selection. They'll ask you to predict what changes this population might undergo in the future. And you're going to start your explanation with, well, the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium says that they won't change if all these are met, but I'm going to predict that they are going to change because there's some selection going on. And then they're going to ask you, like, how will it change? Well, here's how we've come to define evolution again, in numbers, math, gene frequencies and genotype frequencies. And so your prediction might be something like, I predict that the frequency of the dominant A gene is going to increase because here's what's happening. Selection is selecting for it. We'll get to explanations of that in class over and over and over. So here, just real fast, this is why large numbers make a difference. This is all about chance. Chance events can change gene frequencies if your population size is small. But when you have a large population size, thousands or millions, chance events tend to cancel each other out. So that's why large numbers of populations is important in terms of this theoretical non-evolving population, because it eliminates chance events that might cause evolution. We're going to give those chance events another name, unfortunate chosen name, as you're going to see in a little bit.